For decades, the US dollar was considered untouchable. Not because it was perfect, but because it was unavoidable. Oil was priced in dollars, trade was settled in dollars, debt was issued in dollars, and the world's financial nervous system, SWIFT, moved dollars faster and more efficiently than any alternative ever could. The assumption was simple and almost universal. As long as the dollar controlled global payments, American financial power was permanent. But then something happened that quietly rewired the global economy. When Russia and China were pushed away from the Western financial system, many believed it would strengthen the dollar. Instead, it may have triggered the beginning of its slow erosion. The mystery is not whether the dollar collapsed overnight. It didn't. The real question is whether the decision to weaponize SWIFT planted a seed that can no longer be undone. To understand why cutting major economies from SWIFT mattered so much, we need to understand what SWIFT actually is. SWIFT is not a bank, and it does not hold money. It is a messaging system that allows banks to communicate payment instructions across borders. But control over that messaging layer is power. When a country is excluded from SWIFT, its banks become isolated from global finance. Payments become slower, riskier, and more expensive. For decades, this system worked because nearly everyone agreed to play by the same rules. The dollar became dominant not only because of American economic size, but because it sat at the center of trust, liquidity, and enforcement. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system anchored global currencies to the dollar, and the dollar to gold. Even after the gold standard collapsed in 1971, the dollar survived because global trade, especially oil, continued to rely on it. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. Countries needed dollars to trade. To get dollars, they held U.S. debt. To hold U.S. debt, they trusted U.S. institutions. Over time, this trust became infrastructure. And infrastructure once built is hard to replace. But infrastructure can be weaponized. After the Cold War, financial sanctions replaced military intervention as the preferred tool of pressure. Instead of tanks, governments used payment bans, asset freezes, and banking restrictions. Initially, this strategy seemed flawless. Smaller economies collapsed quickly when cut off from dollars. Iran struggled. Venezuela imploded. North Korea retreated further into isolation. Each time, the message was reinforced. Access to the dollar system was a privilege, not a right. The turning point came when sanctions expanded beyond isolated states and targeted systemically important economies. Russia had long been integrated into global energy markets. China was deeply embedded in global manufacturing and trade. When Russia was partially disconnected from SWIFT after geopolitical escalation, and when China watched that process closely, something fundamental changed. For the first time, large economies began planning not just for sanctions relief, but for sanctions immunity. Russia's response was immediate and pragmatic. It built alternatives. Domestic payment systems were expanded. Trade was redirected. Energy exports were sold at discounts but not halted. Settlements shifted to euros, yuan, and local currencies. Gold reserves were increased. Crypto rails were explored quietly. None of these moves replaced the dollar overnight, but they reduced dependence. The goal was no longer dominance, it was survival. China's response was slower, but more structural. Unlike Russia, China did not face immediate expulsion. Instead, it prepared for the possibility. It expanded its cross-border interbank payment system. It increased yuan-denominated trade agreements. It encouraged bilateral settlement deals with energy exporters. It accumulated commodities rather than financial assets. And perhaps most importantly, it observed how quickly access to dollars could be revoked. This is where the unintended consequences began to emerge. The dollar's power relied on universality. The moment access became conditional, risk entered the system. Central banks began asking a new question, not is the dollar safe, but is the dollar politically safe? Once that question exists, behavior changes. Reserves are diversified. Trade contracts are rewritten. Payment channels multiply. None of this caused immediate collapse. In fact, the dollar initially strengthened. During global crises, capital still rushed into U.S. assets, but beneath the surface, the system was fragmenting. Parallel financial networks began to grow not to replace the dollar, but to avoid being trapped by it. Energy trade increasingly moved outside dollar settlement. Regional trade blocs experimented with local currencies. Sanctioned oil flowed through shadow fleets using intermediaries and offshore hubs. The irony is that the very mechanism designed to enforce dollar dominance, financial exclusion, accelerated the creation of alternatives. Sanctions did not eliminate trade, they rerouted it. They did not stop capital flows, they obscured them. The global economy did not shrink. It bifurcated. Over time, this fragmentation created inefficiencies. Liquidity pools became regional. Exchange risk increased. Settlement became slower in some corridors and faster in others. The dollar remained central, but no longer singular. Instead of one system, multiple overlapping systems emerged, some legal, some gray, some deliberately opaque. This shift also changed the psychology of global finance. Trust in the neutrality of financial infrastructure weakened. SWIFT, once seen as a technical utility, became a geopolitical instrument. And once infrastructure is politicized, neutrality is lost permanently. Even if access is restored, the memory remains. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued issuing debt at unprecedented levels. For years, global demand absorbed it effortlessly. But as reserve diversification accelerated, marginal demand softened. Not dramatically but incrementally, interest costs rose. Fiscal flexibility narrowed. Again, no collapse, just pressure. The most dangerous part of this transformation is that it is slow and invisible. There is no single moment when the dollar fails. Instead, its monopoly erodes quietly, share by share, contract by contract, settlement by settlement. Power is not lost all at once, it leaks. History shows this pattern clearly. Empires rarely fall because of one decision. They decline when short-term control undermines long-term trust. Financial systems are especially vulnerable to this dynamic. Once alternatives exist, they are used. Once trust is conditional, it is discounted. Today, the global economy operates in a dual reality. The dollar is still dominant, but no longer unquestioned. SWIFT is still powerful, but no longer exclusive. Sanctions still work, but only at the cost of accelerating bypass mechanisms. What was once leverage is now a catalyst. The final paradox is this: cutting Russia and China from SWIFT did not destroy the dollar in a dramatic sense. It did something more subtle and potentially more irreversible. It proved that the dollar system could be turned off. And once that lesson is learned, the incentive to build alternatives never disappears. 3 conclusions emerge from this story. First, financial power depends on trust more than force. Once trust is politicized, systems fragment. Second, sanctions are effective in the short term but destabilizing in the long term when applied to major economies. And third, monetary dominance fades not through collapse, but through redundancy. The warning is not that the dollar will vanish tomorrow. It's that the world no longer believes there is only one way to trade, save, or settle. A multipolar financial system is slower, messier, and harder to control. But once it exists, it cannot be uninvented. If you want to understand how money, power, geopolitics, and hidden financial systems truly shape the modern world, subscribe to The Dark Economy. Because the most important economic shifts rarely happen in headlines. They happen quietly in the systems beneath them.